revolt behind the walls, inside Saydnaya's forgotten prison uprising. This episode contains descriptions of torture, imprisonment, and state violence. Listener discretion is advised. The drip of forgotten pipes, a distant metal groan, boots on concrete, a scrape on a stained wall, and then silence. Even whispers feared the dark. Men vanished into the air thick with dust and dread, packed into rusting steel boxes and cages, only waiting, breathing, and enduring. New arrivals learned fast. The sounds told the story. Keys, cages, and the dull rhythm of bodies greeted by iron. Veterans knew each strike by sound alone. There was no law here, only mercy, if the guards allowed it. A crackle of a loudspeaker, a command, cold and final. You are now in Saydnaya. You wake on command. You sleep on command. You eat on command. I'm Matt, and this is Frontline Rewind. Today, we go to a place built to erase memory, a prison that came to embody the machinery of repression under Syria's former president, Bashar Al-Assad. It's been over a year since the collapse of Al-Assad's regime. In December 2024, the rebel group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham toppled the Syrian government in a lightning offensive. The former president fled the country, and Ahmed al-Shara was installed as Syria's new leader. As the regime collapsed, prisons were broken open across the country. Tens of thousands were freed after years, even decades, of incarceration. By then, Saydnaya's horrors were already known. At the height of the civil war, which broke out 15 years ago, human rights groups had described the facility, some 20 kilometers from Damascus, as a human slaughterhouse, a place where thousands were executed or perished in atrocious conditions. Most were protesters and fighters who rose up against the regime during the Arab uprisings in 2011, commonly known in the Western world as the Arab Spring. Now, Saydnaya is infamous. Its atrocities have been documented, mapped, reconstructed in memory and testimony. But there is a chapter missing, a moment almost no one outside these walls has likely ever heard about, before the mass hangings, before the machinery of disappearance reached its full industrial scale. There was a revolt inside the prison, a prison uprising, and an atrocity that shook the foundations of this place before the Civil War, and revealed the cracks already forming in a regime that believed it could never fall. Now, Saydnaya was not the oldest prison of the Al-Assad regime. The fortress opened in 1987, a few years after Bashar al-Assad's father, Hafez al-Assad, had crushed a revolt against his government, which had come to power in the 1970s after a coup. The prison itself was tucked into the Kalmun Mountains, a rugged sweep in western Syria, where natural obstacles of windswept slopes, dotted with pines, olives, and scattered villages, surrounded the prison itself. In the highland climate, hot and dry summers could reach about 30 degrees Celsius, while winter temperatures could drop near to or below freezing with snow at higher peaks. The semi-arid flat terrain and hill, stark, bare, and with limited tree cover, were constantly scoured by patrols before a snaking tarmacked road lined with olive green pine trees led to several checkpoints run by military police. Now, beyond those trees and beyond those checkpoints lay Saydnaya prison. From the sky, it is very recognizable across the world. The red building, a distinctive three-pronged star-shaped building dominates the entire facility and is nestled in a maze of military barracks. Adjacent to this red building lies the white building, an L-shaped structure also surrounded by army installations and where other prisoners were kept. Ringed by minefields and three reinforced concrete walls, dotted with watchtowers and rings of barbed wire, escape was near impossible, and the prison had for years been veiled in near total secrecy. No one, save the guards and the jailers, had ever seen the inside of the prison. Inside Saydnaya, nothing happened unwatched. Cold, fixed cameras stared down every corridor. Cell blocks, hallways, the exercise yards, even the kitchens and the heavy steel entrances. Infrared lenses scanned the dark, tracking bodies through shadows, making sure no corner ever truly disappeared from view. And behind those walls, another kind of surveillance ran quietly. In dim offices, guards filled thick black notebooks, lines of cramped handwriting, names, factions, whispered loyalties, religious leanings, political history. Every man inside was catalogued, sorted, studied, not just for control, but for leverage. Who might break? Who might inform? Who could be used against his own cellmates? Even torture could be outsourced, handed off to those already held in chains. This wasn't a system that didn't just watch you, it learned you, and then it used you. New prisoners arriving were given what was commonly known as a reception party. They were beaten, processed, stripped, and broken in cages. Those who didn't follow the rules were sent to the room with the black door. Behind there, they were tortured, sometimes for hours. After the reception, they were then flung into cells of 4 square meters, with barely enough room to stand or sit in the gloom, the silence only punctured by the sounds of brutal beatings elsewhere. Time became measured by meals and scarcity of water, 10 litres per week for one person. Those that complied were soon released out into the main cells to join the other men incarcerated, but newcomers at the beginning were in a black box, largely scrubbed from the face of the earth. But who were the prisoners they joined? They were a mirror of Syria's political climate, a portrait of generational conflict across the Middle East. The first wave, faded symbols of a long-dead democratic republic, aging communists, purged Baathists, Nasserists, and Saddam loyalists, people who stood up to the regime when it first came to power. The second wave, Bashar Al-Assad's main nemesis, consisting of Islamists from the Fighting Vanguard and the Muslim Brotherhood. While life in Saydnaya was anything but normal, life eventually settled into its own rhythm. Prison life had its own grinding monotony. Every moment was thoroughly scrutinized by the military police. Roll calls, exploitation, beatings, inspections, scrounging for food, more beatings, smuggling goods and letters in and out, all while avoiding solitary and the dreaded black door. It all became ritual to preserve sanity, but it all had its own routine. 5 o'clock to 7 o'clock, breakfast. 9 o'clock to 10 o'clock, breathing time in the exercise yards. 12 o'clock, roll call. 1 o'clock, cleaning and maintenance. 2 o'clock, lunch. 7 o'clock, return to your cells. Indignities remained ever present. Showers were often a vicious affair, with prisoners shoved in and out of the central bathroom in batches, hosed down like factory milk bottles being scoured for reuse. A quick glance sideways, a shift of the gaze towards another detainee could land a prisoner behind the black door or weeks in solitary. Family visits were rare. It took months of legal limbo and bribery to obtain approval to go to the prison. After hours of walking to the prison, subjected to humiliating inspections, and rustled for money, they met relatives separated by a net a metre apart. The brief feel-good hormones of oxytocin, dopamine, and serotonin, released by a simple hug, were withheld and denied. Families could be thrown out on a whim after months of obtaining approval and hours of waiting to see their loved ones. The bribes the families were subjected to underpinned everything that kept Saydnaya turning. The invoice. Inside Saydnaya, survival had a price tag, a quiet economy of despair, and the easiest way to stay alive. Families scraped together money not for luxuries, but for a cup of lentils, a slice of cheese, a spoon of jam, medicine, clean clothes. Everything had a cost, and every cost fed the system. Corruption wasn't hidden, it was the system. If the guards got their cut, radios slipped through, letters passed between cells, and food arrived from the outside. Soon, a strange kind of economy flourished behind the walls. Prisoners brewed alcohol the guards drank. Televisions and metal bed frames were smuggled in, circled from wing to wing like contraband relics. A small library even appeared, books on politics, psychology, religion, even a clinic opened, funded by detainees themselves. By 2004, they had improved heating, rigged light and power, and renovated parts of the prison with tools they shouldn't have had, but found anyway. For some men, especially those who had survived worse prisons in Syria, Saydnaya even felt, in their words, like half a release. One former prisoner put it plainly in the book Syrian Gulag: "Can paradise be compared to hell?" But paradise here was fragile. It could vanish overnight with a single order, because this wasn't mercy, it was business. All guided by the invoice. The prison profited from its inmates, and the guards could double prices, cut rations, or starve an entire wing to force families to pay more. As one detainee remembered, they made prison food even worse, so we had to buy from outside. Everything was part of the invoice. Even if survival was a transaction, the status quo flourished for a time, but the prison was not impervious to the shifting currents of the Middle East, which was constantly changing as the intergenerational conflict continued. A new wave of prisoners was now arriving. Kurds, distanced from the crushed civil society movement and riots that had spread across Syria in 2004, but perhaps more potently, militant and quietist Salafi jihadists were arriving in Saydnaya from across the region, from Iraq, from parts of Syria, and even Lebanon. Now, Syria had played its own game in the region for decades, feeding the flames abroad in its conflict with the United States, Israel, Turkey, whoever was standing in the way of its foreign policy objectives. It had used Kurdish militants, Lebanese militants, and Palestinian militants to try and accomplish its goal and sow chaos across the region. Now, in 2003, it was cultivating jihadists when convenient and exporting them like weapons to Iraq after the invasion of the country by American forces. But when Washington, mired in Iraq and Afghanistan after 9/11, demanded cooperation, Damascus was expected to sweep them up. Attending a protest, participating in a sermon, or listening to a preacher, acts of civil disobedience, tapes of even a moderate Salafist, all were one-way tickets to prison as repression was cranked up by Bashar Al-Assad. The new prisoners immediately impacted the prison. Old dormitory lines blurred. Veterans who had invested so much time and effort into building something out of the misery of Saydnaya eyed the newcomers with suspicion as routines frayed, and far from diffusing tensions between the warring wings, prison officials leant into them. The guards called the Democrats the spies, and whispered Al-Qaeda whenever the Salafis passed. In the yard, glances sharpened into stares, alliances frayed before they could form. One cell's prayer was another proof of betrayal. And the wardens watched it all with quiet satisfaction. And certain wings, as a result of the change in the prison population, were becoming ripe for ideological recruitment and mentoring for militant Salafism, the brand we more commonly known to be associated with Al-Qaeda and Islamic State today. After weeks of beatings, men turned to the radical scriptures. Some became converts, and those already extreme on arrival deepened their zealotry, fantasizing about liberating Syria from Saydnaya. The call to prayer echoed down corridors, and the Islamic legal system, derived from the Quran and the Sunnah, the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, began to govern relations in prison circles, as the newly arrived Salafis tried to find solidarity amongst the prison's corruption and lawlessness. The spies, more moderate Islamists and Democrats, pressed up close to their more conservative neighbours keen to upend the status quo they had established with the envoys, began to get angry and grumbled. After all, being prescribed as a heretic for reading in a library about capitalist economics, admonished for turning a profit off of alcohol to buy off guards or get better food, or being berated for having a liberal worldview was not ideal in an already cruel prison system where space was tight. Some veterans who had spent many years within the prison had worked for years to get TVs and radios into the dormitories. Having hot-headed militant newcomers disrupting that routine, trying to prohibit music and other hard-earned privileges rubbed some the wrong way. There was a very delicate balance they'd already established with the prison guards to have those luxuries. But it was dangerous to confront many of these men. After all, some of them were hardened ideologues of Al-Qaeda, and as one prisoner put it, some of them were even more extreme than Al-Qaeda themselves and developing into something much more sinister that we would later know today as the Islamic State. As the detainee said, a more militant current of Al-Qaeda was born in Saydnaya. This group considered everyone infidels, even Salafi jihadists and Al-Qaeda. These absolutists were becoming a growing problem, so much so that they were too extreme even for Al-Qaeda's leaders within Saydnaya. They instructed their own men amongst the prison population to steer clear of these radicals. But despite these frictions, the guards and the prison director and their informants kept leaning into these frictions for exploitation and personal gain. One affront, one alleged blasphemy, finally became too much. A makeshift shari court in a dormitory. A pipe, a beating in the dark, a man dead, others broken beside him. It was a murder not by the guards, but by other prisoners. Men had begun treating their fellow inmates, not as victims of the state, but as heretics to be purified. For the guards, it was a red line crossed, but manageable. But then something unthinkable happened. An escape from Saydnaya prison. No one escapes the prison. No one leaves unless the state releases them. But a man vanished. Some say he slipped out in sacks of flour. Others say he walked out with visitors dressed as a guard. No one knew, but everyone was talking about it. The impossible had occurred, and the prison was awash with talk. For the guards, the murder of a prisoner meant little. Life in Saydnaya was cheap. Violence was routine. But an escape? That was rebellion. For those outside Saydnaya prison, the situation didn't look good. A prisoner dead, Sharia law behind bars, loose prisoners, corruption running amok. An example had to be set. Chaos at the prison had stirred power beyond the walls. The prison director was transferred and his replacement came down hard. The invoice was rolled back. Gas for cooking was removed. Electricity for heating and dim bulbs was cut off. Breathing time became a luxury. And the invoice system that brought privileges and perks that helped prisoners survive, gone. Every Salafi prisoner was monitored or faced draconian punishments. For 2 years, as this iron fist policy endured, prisoners had to bend the rules to get what they needed, now that the invoice had been rolled back. Being caught could land you in solitary or a torture chamber, but desperation for a morsel of food outside army rations, the desire for warmth, light to read, it inevitably encouraged risk-taking. Squeezed to breaking point, the prison was drowning in desperation and fanaticism, and a fire was rising in the prison. For 2 years this system endured, as the regime tightened the screw. 2 years of pressure, 2 years without relief, 2 years of iron fist rule, until the pressure finally snapped. In spring, a light bulb was discovered by an officer. In the ensuing argument, insults were hurled, and the prisoners attacked the outnumbered guard. Battered and bruised, he returned to the prison director. The prisoners weren't punished, though. Instead, the prison director promised them running water and electricity. Celebrating, prisoners went down to the showers to wash their matted hair, tangled beards, and the filth from their bodies after weeks without washing. Suddenly, soldiers with thick black cables descended upon them, whipping the soles of their feet as they scrambled, clad in nothing but dirty towels and clothes wrapped around their waists. They had been betrayed, but then power panicked. Throngs of men surrounded the police. The guards were outnumbered, yet again, largely unarmed and without the right gear. The inmates lashed out with punches and kicks as panic set in. Fearful jailers ran, slamming the heavy metal doors behind them. To no avail. Lockdown had failed. One by one, the cell doors swung open or were forced apart, as over 1,000 prisoners cascaded out of their wings. As they emerged from their cells, a sharp metallic clink, then a bloom of smoke arched through the air. Canisters tumbled across the concrete with a vicious clatter, trailing ghostly tendrils behind them, as tear gas seeped into the halls. Gunfire cracked overhead, as panicked guards fired warning shots into the air. Prisoners broke out onto the roof of the prison, and atop the white building, smoke curled into the sky, as crude piles of wood and old blankets burned on the rooftops, a signal, a desperate flare to an apathetic world, and a warning to Syria beyond. As chaos reigned, a message finally arrived. It was time for negotiation. The prisoners submitted their demands to the authorities of the prison: an end to torture, fair family visits, trials in civilian, not military courts, the abolition of solitary confinement, better food and healthcare, reasonable requests in a normal prison. The demands were submitted to the prison director, military intelligence, and several senior commanders. Miraculously, they were accepted. Prisoners could scarcely believe it. They celebrated. The riot was over. Almost as suddenly as it had begun, the fires of the prison were extinguished. An uneasy quiet fell over Saydnaya. Prison security slackened its grip almost completely. As celebrations continued, others were uneasy. Something wasn't right. No prison in Syria loosens its obsessive grip so willingly. Not in Assad's paranoid police state, where every operative spies on the other, let alone the prison population. This was Syria. Behind the scenes, the regime was quietly preparing for war. An argument over a light bulb, a disturbance in the shower which had escalated into a riot, had been enough to be escalated to the Office of National Security. Reports were no longer filtered through the prison director and military police for petty retaliations and feuds. They were now being passed directly to the very architects of Saydnaya: military intelligence. Summer, July. Morning sun crept into the sky, and cheers of joy were ringing down the halls of Saydnaya. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar echoed from the wings. Rumours swirled that a general amnesty was in the offing, a similar one offered by President Bashar Al-Assad in the early 1990s. Thousands had been released in these amnesties, and now it was their turn. The doors of the cells and dormitories opened, and they expected their freedom. Police, fresh-faced recruits came like factory-made soldiers, encased in black polymer and fiberglass, their faces sealed behind visors. They had come prepared. Cables in hand, the beatings began, and prisoners were placed under arrest. Again. Prisoners were bound, the zip of tightening plastic loops coiling shut, biting into skin, turning wrists purple as names were checked off lists and men were dragged across floors. Forced labourers and informants seized what they could: trinkets, odds and ends, televisions, small gas stoves, anything of value to the prisoners, all courtesy of the prison director for their loyalty to the regime. The police and their accomplice spread across the prison. Eager newbies plunged into enemy territory. But suddenly, they found themselves cut off and surrounded in a maze of unknown corridors and dank, dark cells. Screaming, angry-faced prisoners confronted them, wielding makeshift shivs and metal bars. Hardened convicts, some battle-hardened soldiers of Al-Qaeda. Units withdrew, not before slamming the doors behind them, leaving the prisoners with hostages from the police, bargaining chips for a regime that had betrayed them yet again. But what of the informants who had been captured by the prisoners? In prison, being labelled a snitch was a death sentence. Informing meant condemning fellow prisoners to torture, solitary, or worse. With the balance of power now shifted, those who had whispered to the guards and taken from the other prisoners now faced the wrath of their fellow inmates. They were harshly interrogated in one of the wards. For some factions, that was simply not enough. The doors to the ward burst open as the interrogations were ongoing. Standing in the doorway were those loyal to Al-Qaeda and Islamic State. They had business with the snitches and traitors. They were taken away, and in one of the wings, Salafi prisoners spoke the charges as the bruised informants were held by the arms or kneeling. Informing on brothers carried a harsh sentence. They had betrayed the Ummah. The Shari court had made its decision. The prisoners were hauled away. Thuds, screams, screeches as their new guards got to work. 6 informants were later found sprawled across the ground floor. Grudges harboured by the zealots against heretics were also being settled in anarchy as they took control of the prison. A prominent human rights activist was found crumpled, limbs twisted. His skull had been shattered by the zealots, the face turned to bloody pulp, unrecognisable after being taken away by masked men. No one was safe, caught between the fundamentalists and regime soldiers. The sharp crack of gunfire could now be heard outside. Inside it was closer and sharper. The pop 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 of rifles down concrete halls. These were no longer warning shots, but fired with intent to kill. Prisoners reverted to stoking fires atop the prison once more. Power was panicking. The prison director lifted the receiver. Down the road, less than an hour away, help waited. At the Ministry of the Interior, fear spread quickly. A botched military police raid had spiraled into a hostage crisis. Saydnaya was no longer a prison, it was a battlefield, and the regime responded hard, as it always did, to dissent and chaos. Army trucks, special forces and counter-terrorism units rolled into the prison, encircling the compound. Boots hit the dirt. The siege of the prison had begun. The prisoners barricaded entrance to wings and made the roof impossible to land on by helicopter. The regime were denied landing pads. However, they were unable to prevent food and water from falling into the army's hands. Prisoners were calling into radio stations around the world with smuggled smartphones and mobile devices they found. Stories of shot prisoners and hostages filtered through before the signal was cut by the regime. Negotiations eventually began after months of stalemate, as they besieged the prison and tightened the noose. Eventually, the prisoners, caught between the fundamentalists and the regime, wanted food and water. In exchange, the regime wanted the hostages returned. Some of the battered hostages, the policemen who had raided the prison initially, stripped to their underwear and wounded, were released from the main building. Fighting resumed as the army tightened the noose. As the lights went out at Saydnaya, global human rights groups urged for immediate investigations into the deaths. The world was finally paying attention. Amnesty International is calling upon the Syrian authorities to establish immediately an independent body to investigate reports that at least 23 detainees were killed in disturbances. Anyone reasonably suspected of involvement in the killings must be held accountable and brought to justice. But concerns abroad fell on deaf ears as days became weeks, and weeks became months in 2007. Starvation and thirst set in. Supplies dwindled. Many prisoners were running out of patience, opening a separate channel to the regime to negotiate, breaking with Al-Qaeda and Islamic State. Leaders amongst the prisoners, for their own safety in many ways, were blindfolded and handcuffed, ferried to Damascus for talks. When they arrived, a figure stood before them. It was none other than Asef Shorkat, Bashar Al-Assad's brother-in-law and the former head of military intelligence, the architects of Saydnaya. The earthquake in the prison had reached the ears of the palace itself. Shorkat offered terms: a pardon for the unfortunate events of the past few months, more visits, and new prisons while they dealt with the zealots. The prisoners agreed. In batches, the surrendering prisoners were moved out to new prisons across Syria. 88 detainees remained, determined to fight on. The final assault began. Helicopters buzzed overhead as soldiers rappelled onto the roof of the white building. One of the gates was forced open by regime soldiers. Plain-clothed and uniformed men poured into the facility. The message was simple: no prisoners. The radicals who had murdered their own and several regime police and soldiers knew the final outcome. The soldiers haphazardly clambered through the prison. As they swept through the prison, insults were hurled at them, and the jihadists fought to the last, trading bullets for martyrdom. Only 3 survived, hauled off to Branch 291, a branch military intelligence used in Damascus, where they were subject to further interrogation and torture. Some soldiers sat resting after the assault. Others stood quietly, rifles tucked under their arms or slung over their shoulders, as others clambered over discarded belongings, bodies and shattered brick and concrete strewn across the courtyard. Others gleefully recorded the macabre spectacle of smoke and death, blood everywhere. The siege of Saydnaya was over, the massacre hidden. For a time, the killing of over 100 prisoners in 2007 in Saydnaya prison, and where they were buried, remained a mystery to the Syrian public and indeed the world. Many of the bodies were hastily disposed of beneath the broken surface of the prison itself. Families pursued the case, determined to find out where their loved ones were buried. Nothing had been confirmed by the regime. A whole year has passed, and yet no one knows what has happened to these people, said the Middle East and North Africa director at Human Rights Watch. The Syrian government should end the anguish of the prisoners' families, disclose the names of those injured or killed, and immediately grant them access to their loved ones. But where the regime said nothing, its sloppiness spoke volumes. From smartphones, from computers, free from surveillance, locked behind basically encrypted VPNs and digital cameras, the regime was finally caught out. Grainy videos began to appear on Facebook. Other clips surfaced on a place called Twitter, free from regime surveillance in internet cafes, linking Syrians to the world. Syrians stared at screens quietly, logging on to group pages and platforms. What they saw was horrifying. A pile of mutilated corpses, shaky footage of bodies buried underground, snipers firing from cranes, a man casually filming corpses strewn across the courtyard. Some believed it was the brother of Bashar Al-Assad, Maher al-Assad, although that was never clarified. A destroyed prison and a mass killing cut through the regime's silence. The first ever images of Saydnaya were not just of death, but of impunity. The truth of Assad's Syria laid bare. A regime so confident in its violence it no longer cared what people saw. Saydnaya stood charred but intact. But the fire that broke loose inside its walls had not stayed there. For Saydnaya was not an anomaly. It was a microstate, a distilled version of the wider Middle East in the late 2000s. The same architecture of repression, the same rituals of humiliation, the same economy of fear. What happened behind those concrete walls was a mirror of what was stirring from Damascus to Tripoli to Cairo in the 2000s. Youth suffocated, ideologies colliding, regimes aging into paranoia, and the storm of rebellion gathering in the wind. Saydnaya's uprising was a mirror of what Syria would become in miniature. The prison uprising was a warning of the conflicts to come, and of a new country to emerge from the ashes of the Assad regime when it fell in 2024. Innocents caught between two extremes, that of militant Salafi extremism and the dictatorial brutality of the Assad regime. Today, the regime that built Saydnaya has fallen. Its leader has fled. The gates at last torn from their hinges. Cells sit empty, names and numbers scratched into concrete, some waiting for light that never came in time. Saydnaya is broken open and the ghosts have room to breathe. But the question remains. When concrete crumbles and tyrants fall, what rises in their place? Memory or revenge? Justice or just another order built on bones? In the end, the walls of Saydnaya cracked. not because they were weak, but because the people inside refused to disappear. And the lesson that escapes with them is simple. A nation can bury its truth in darkness, but it cannot stop the day when the doors finally open. This story isn't finished. Not for the survivors of Saydnaya, not for the families today, and not for the country still living with its ghosts. I'm Matt, and this is Frontline Rewind. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.